Welcome, my dear students of class 8A and 8B, to my history class. Today's points are, as mentioned in the book, consequences of the Anglo-Maratha Wars, conquest of Punjab, consequences of Anglo-Sikh War, Treaty of Lahore, and decline of doctrine of lands. First point, consequences of the Anglo-Maratha Wars. What are the consequences of the Anglo-Maratha Wars? There were three Anglo-Maratha wars fought between the Marathas and the British. In the first Anglo-Maratha War, the Treaty of Salwai was signed in the year 1782 at the end of the first Anglo-Maratha War. The first Anglo-Maratha War continued for 7 years, and the war ended with decisive victory of both the two sides. The war was in favor of the Marathas as well as in favor of the British. But one thing the British was able to establish, that was, they were able to establish their political influence in India and also prove that they could defeat Indian rulers like the Marathas. Now the second Anglo-Maratha War. What were the consequences of the second Anglo-Maratha War? The second Anglo-Maratha War was the war the British broke the backbone of the Maratha nation. The two Maratha rulers, Bhosle and Scindia, and their families, Bajirao too, other ruler of the same Maratha region, were compelled to enter into a subsidiary alliance. The terms of the subsidiary alliance they were compelled to accept it. And ultimately, they were forced to give some of their lands and host British troops, and also accepted the terms of maintaining one British resident at their own cost in their state. That's why it is said that the second Anglo-Maratha War broke the backbone of the Maratha nation by the British. In the third Anglo-Maratha War, it was a war between the Afghans and the Marathas. The Marathas, captured two territories which were already occupied by Ahmad Shah Abdali. And Ahmad Shah Abdali was an invader. But it was a political mistake or a fault of the Marathas, Sindh and Lahore, the two important territories occupied by the Marathas, occupied by the Afghans. The Marathas captured it. The news reached Ahmad Shah Abdali. He came and declared the third Anglo-Maratha War. So the two powers fought against each other, the Marathas and the Afghans. Under the bold leadership of Ahmad Shah Abdali, the Marathas were badly defeated in the third Battle of Panipat in the year 1761. The British powers had been eagerly waiting for the defeat of the Marathas, because Marathas' dream for establishing an all-Indian empire was not fulfilled. With the defeat of the Marathas, the British became the chief political entity in India. Next point, conquest of Punjab. Conquest of Punjab. The Sikh kingdom became a very powerful kingdom, an independent state in North India under the leadership of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. As per the Treaty of Amritsar, signed between Maharaja Ranjit Singh and the British East India Company in the year 1809, the British agreed not to interfere in the political affairs of the Sikh kingdom. But soon after the death of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, a war of succession broke out in the Sikh kingdom, which led to political instability within the state, and the British decided to take its advantages. They thought that Maharaja Ranjit Singh, with whom they had a peace treaty, in absence of him, they could take undue advantage from the Sikh kingdom because they remained busy in war of succession. So it was a golden opportunity for the Britishers. They should avail themselves of the opportunity, and ultimately, the two wars were fought between the Sikhs and the British. The first Anglo-Sikh War in the year 1845 and continued 1 year, and another one, Second Anglo-Sikh War, it was started in the year 1848 and continued for 1 year. Now, what were the consequences of the two Anglo-Sikh wars? The Sikhs were defeated in the first Anglo-Sikh War, which resulted in signing of the Treaty of Lahore. According to the Treaty of Lahore, the Sikhs had to part with 2/3 of their kingdom along with the territory extending from the beach to the Satluj River. The Sikh army was reduced to 20,000 cavalry, 12,000 infantry, and a British resident was stationed at Lahore. So the first Anglo-Sikh War, made the Sikhs dependent on the British. The British made them a power under their hands. That's why they reduced the army of the Sikhs to only 20,000 cavalry, 12,000 infantry, and a British resident. Instead of 1 lakh, 1 lakh cavalry, the British reduced to 20,000. The British reduced to it by 20,000, and there were 50,000 infantry, 50,000 infantry. It was also reduced. A British resident was forced to be maintained by the Sikhs, and under such conditions and terms of the Treaty of Lahore, the first Anglo-Sikh War ended. And Second Anglo-Sikh War, it sealed the fate of Punjab. The Second Anglo-Sikh War sealed the fate of Punjab. It led to the total annexation of the last independent and powerful state of India by the British in the year 1849. So the entire portion of the state Punjab came under British control by the mid of 19th century. mid 19th century. An expansion under Dalhousie. Next point, the doctrine of lapse. Lord Dalhousie came to India as Governor General. He was also an expansionist. His expansionist policy, you know, captured many Indian states without declaring any war. Now the British realized that the policy of Lord Hastings' paramountcy or outright wars forced the British to spend a lot of money in India. The Indian powers could not fight properly against the British. They had no strategy, they had no bold leadership, they had no good armaments, they had no naval power, but the Britishers. That's why it was of no use to declare any war against the Indian regional powers, and almost all regional powers came under their control. The Britishers occupied their states. That's why Lord Dalhousie, as a Governor General, introduced the policy of subsidiary alliance. Introduced the policy of doctrine of the subsidiary alliance was done by Lord Wellesley. He introduced the policy of doctrine of lapse. Now, what were the system of the doctrine of lapse? What was the system of that very policy? As per doctrine of lapse, Indian ruler or Indian kings adopted any heir to the throne after their death, that heir would not be legalized by the British. That means an Indian king who issued no legal heir, but in order to protect their property, huge property, that very king hired one adopted son. It was the system. Earlier, that system was followed by the Indian rulers, or provincial or regional rulers. But in order to capture their territories, their property, the British decided to introduce a new system of policy through which, without declaring war, their states would come under British control. This policy was the doctrine of lapse. That means whenever one Indian state adopted any heir to their throne without having any legal issue, that adopted son would be declared illegal and the property of that very kingdom or that very state would come under British control. It was the system of the doctrine of lapse. And what happened to the doctrine of lapse? What are the other terms and conditions of the doctrine of lapse? Next day I shall teach you up to this. Now, who introduced the doctrine of lapse? Lord Dalhousie. Who was Lord Dalhousie? The Governor General of India. And after the end of whose rule Lord Dalhousie came to India as a Governor General? After the end of Lord Hastings, Lord Dalhousie came to India as a Governor General, and reaching India, he saw that there was a huge amount of money already the British spent in declaring war against Indian regional kingdoms. And everywhere the British defeated regional kingdoms and their rulers. All the major powers of India, the Sikhs, the Marathas, the the Marathas, the Sikhs, the Rajputs, they all were defeated by the British. And Mysore also came under the under British power. So this is the reason Lord Dalhousie decided not to spend a single amount of money in declaring war against the regional kingdoms. So what technique and aggressive policy and expansionist policy the early Governor General Lord Wellesley had followed, the same technique, same method Governor General Lord Dalhousie followed. He introduced the doctrine of lapse. Without declaring war, he started capturing Indian states. He started capturing Indian wealth, money of different states, different regional kingdoms, and started draining wealth to their own country, England. Next day, other terms of the doctrine of lapse I shall discuss. Up to this. Thank you.